You know, one of the things that you do when you're looking at some of these questions, like what we've got this week, in respect to the mousetrap idea that goes back through Augustine, is really need to get inside this thing. There's a principle in philosophy called the principle of intimate engagement. And what that means is that you try and get inside the thing that you're looking at in such a way that you can see it from lots of different angles. In a simple sense, it's sort of like having a dryer or a dishwasher that doesn't work. And what you do, instead of sort of kicking it and thinking to yourself, oh, I've got to pay out $65 to find the local kitchen technician to look after it, what you say is to yourself, I will try and get inside this thing to see exactly what it is that's going on and take it to the limit of my knowledge and see whether I can fix it. And what you do then is that you put it on its side, you look and you see how the motor works and so forth, the conveyor belt that's inside of it, and you see whether there's anything in there that can actually help you to work it. There's a sense in which it's the classical view of a thing. A romantic view of a thing is to look and see a dishwasher from a standpoint of how shiny it looks, how new it is, how it works so well. The classical view is to look and see, how does this thing work? What is it that drives it? What's the motor for? And what does the motor do? And how then does the whole thing work? Now, if you want to be really thorough on that, you become a dishwasher technician. But we can't do that. So what we try and do is to get as far as we can inside of it. We reach the extent of our knowledge. And it's the same thing here with this notion of the mousetrap view, is to think about it and mull it over, spend a few minutes thinking about it, and then just sort of go away and then come back and think, what is it you're dealing with? What you're dealing with essentially is not a mechanism in terms of how that Jesus saves us, because as we know from the chapter of McGrath, there's lots of different ways that you can articulate this. This whole notion of a mousetrap arose out of the Christus Victor analogy in respect to the victorious nature of what Jesus has done in freeing us from death, sin, Hades, and so forth. So what is a metaphor? Well, in Greek, a metaphor is from which we get the word metaphor. It's meta and foreign. Meta means something like a cross, and foreign, from which we get the word ferry, is to carry. So something is carried across from something to something else. Usually something that is known is carried across to something that is unknown, so that then the known becomes a vehicle through which to appreciate something that's new. And from that standpoint, you have to work out what is the extent of the metaphor and when does it leave being a metaphor and become something else that's not congruent with the notion of what the ultimate thing is. Now, having said that then, the idea in the first few centuries that was very strong in the early church was that Christ was the victor over the devil, that he had banished all the powers of evil, the principalities, the elements of the universe, the devil himself, and had led them captive. Ephesians chapter 4 verse 8. Led them captive as a Roman emperor would lead captive in Rome when he had achieved victory over a race of people, a tribe, and brought them to Rome and brought the gifts then from that captivity, in which he would show the Roman people and show off what he'd done. So from that standpoint then, Christ has become the captive. He has captured then all the forces of evil and destroyed them. So that's how the idea came out. And then the metaphor of a mousetrap is, I'm saying it carefully here because notice I've used metaphor, not mechanism. If you start looking at a mechanism, then you start to take the metaphorical elements of it in a too literal way. For example, some of the other elements that McGrath deals with, like for example substitution and ransom. You take the idea of ransom as a metaphor. A price was paid for our freedom. That price is the death of Christ. Now, when you start asking questions that it goes beyond the singular notion of the metaphor, that's when you get into trouble. Who is the price paid to? Is the price paid to the devil? If the price is paid to the devil, does that mean that in some sense God had a bargain with the devil? Something a bit like Job in a way, in the book of Job. And what God says is then, I will pay the ransom of what is needed to free these people. And the ransom then is the death of Christ. And so that's paid over to the devil. In what sense is the ransom paid to the devil? And what does the devil get out of it? It almost seems like a dualism there, where you've got two competing forces together, God and the devil, and they're making an arrangement to buy back humanity from sin. And the mechanism, the monetary factor that brings about the deal, so to speak, is the death of Christ. And that sort of makes Christ in some sort of servient way, almost like a mechanical instrument or a non-personal instrument through which to give himself then to free us from sin. It's the same thing with substitution. When Christ is in our place as a substitute, which goes back to the Old Testament substitutes of animals in Leviticus 4, in which the priest would put his hand upon the head of the animal that was to be put to death, and through that mechanism the way that the people then would identify with the priest, and the sins of Israel were put upon the animal was put to death. Well, if you go too far with that idea of substitution, it takes you into a sense of what is it exactly that should occur to us. Should we die? In other words, we die spiritually and we die physically, as what Christ has done in respect to a substitution? Is it that we have put to death Christ by the sins that we have committed because his death is in our place? Can we just use the idea of substitution in the sense that he takes on our sin? It gets very complicated. And the New Testament uses lots of different metaphors. I've just mentioned three, well, actually two. The idea of substitution and ransom. The mousetrap metaphor is not one that is in the New Testament, to my knowledge. It's gleaned from the New Testament, but it's used by people like Augustine. And what is the idea? The idea is based upon the victory of Christ over the forces of evil, as I've said. And it's seen in the sense that the devil sees Christ on the earth, Jesus, and wants to get him to sin. Well, he tries throughout Jesus' ministry to get him to sin, and he's unsuccessful. So then what he says to himself is, then what I will do is get rid of him. So then he kills Jesus, and Jesus then is in the Hadean world, and it looks like that the devil has now got everything, because he's put to death Jesus. He controls Hades, the unseen world, the world of death and sin, and has now got Jesus in that world, except for one thing. In other words, Jesus in that sense is the cheese. And the devil's fallen for it, because there's one thing that's missing in it that the devil didn't know. The devil didn't know that this is God himself, and that this is a sinless offering. And because it's a sinless offering, then the devil has no obligation onto the person, because the devil can only claim those that are sinful. So therefore it looks like suddenly, he's overstepped his mark. And now what's happened is it's almost like you pull up the tail of the mouse who's caught in the trap, and this time the mouse is the devil himself. So he's caught in the mousetrap. In his joy, he thinks he's contained Christ and stopped everything that Christ wants to do. But because Jesus is sinless, it means that in the unseen world, the devil has no power over him. He has no obligation towards the devil because he's not sinned. It's complicated stuff. And you don't hear about it that much in church circles. You should to some degree, because it's the basis of what our Christianity is. It's the theories of atonement we're talking about. Notice that I've said theories, plural, and I also have used the word theories. In other words, it's a multiple nature of doctrines that the church has not decided on which one is the most prominent one. There's others I've not mentioned, for example, the judicial element, the forensic element in which we're freed on the basis of the judicial death of Jesus. I'm just basically dealing with the mousetrap element. But there's parts of it that you might find that are useful as you apply it to yourself in terms of answering the question. Number one is the hidden nature of the kingdom of God. Where is the kingdom of God found? It's found in the children who are on the sidelines, so to speak, until Jesus comes and brings them into his midst and hugs them. Or it's found in Lazarus and the rich man. It's found in the poor man Lazarus on the side of the road. In other words, it's always hidden. It's the mustard tree that's very small and can't be seen. And in this particular case, the mousetrap theory is that the kingdom of God is hidden and the devil can't see it. And the devil comes and tries then to completely be victorious over Christ, but he himself then accepts the bait and is pulled out of pulled off the floor, so to speak, in the mousetrap. We see that the devil's in the mousetrap. In other words, then, the hidden nature of the kingdom is hidden even to the devil. And the idea of being hidden, it's always hidden in our own lives as we see the kingdom spread. That's one idea. Another would be the element of powerlessness. What's significant about Jesus' death is when you consider the forces that went up against him, not so much the spiritual forces here, but the political forces that were in manufacture with the devil. I'm thinking of the Roman Empire and the Jewish forces, the Sanhedrin and Pilate and so forth. These are part of what you'd call the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, which comes through violence, redemptive violence. This is how we solve it. You come against me with a sword, I come against you with a bigger sword. So what the Roman authorities did is they came against Jesus with the whole power of the state of redemptive violence, and they put him to death. They killed him. Except that in the powerlessness nature of the mousetrap, now, here is Jesus, here is God in the mousetrap, here is God caught, here is God's powerlessness because Jesus was passive in allowing himself to be crucified. Here in this powerlessness is the foolishness of the gospel. Because in the foolishness of the gospel, which seems entirely passive, this is the basis from which we achieve our salvation and victory through love. Fascinating concepts. Just trying to crack open for you the mousetrap theory so that it will help you as you approach it this week. Thank you.